They said elephants don't grieve like we do. But when she collapsed, barely breathing, he didn't follow the herd. He stood beside her, and their calf watched in silence, learning what love truly looks like. They said bull elephants never stay, that they wander, that they fight, that they live alone because solitude is in their blood. But this one didn't leave, not when it mattered most. The herd had moved on days ago, swallowed by the horizon and the promise of water miles away. The dry winds had already begun to sting. Dust clung to everything. The savanna cracked open beneath their feet like old skin. This was no place to linger, no place to wait. But still, he stayed, beside her, the one who had given life, and nearly lost hers in doing so. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes barely open. The pain had stolen almost everything, but not him. And beside her lay the calf, barely hours old, trembling against the cold of a night too big, too empty. She didn't yet understand what survival meant, but she knew one thing. Her world was made of two giants, and one of them would not rise. Yet the other, he remained, not out of obligation, not out of instinct, but because something deeper had rooted itself inside him. Something no drought could dry out, no fear could scatter, no tradition could erase. And in that stillness, between the silence of the stars and the rasp of her labored breath, something sacred took hold. He became more than a guardian. He became home. He should have left. That's what instinct demanded. The matriarch had already called the herd forward. Water was running low. The dry season was setting in early, and every mile mattered now. But as the dust rose from the retreating footsteps, he stayed. He stayed beside the mother of his calf. Her breath was shallow, her strength gone after a grueling birth. She had given everything to bring their daughter into the world, everything but her last breath, and he couldn't leave that behind. Predators watched from the edges. The lions knew a lone elephant, especially one standing still, meant opportunity, but he made no move, no bluff, no charge, just silence. And somehow that silence said enough. He shielded her with his shadow during the hottest hours. He nudged at water holes to help her drink. He trumpeted when the vultures circled. And when his calf cried, still too young to understand, he wrapped his trunk around her gently, as if to say, "She's still here. I am still here." Days passed. Other elephants came and went, some from neighboring herds, some stragglers from their own. Some paused in surprise. Others moved on. None stayed. But he remained. And in his staying, something began to shift. Not in the earth, but in his calf. Where fear had once rooted itself, safety bloomed. Where confusion had lingered, trust grew. She watched him, watched how he stood, how he refused to waver, how he never looked back toward the herd but only forward, toward them. He taught her what devotion looked like, not in grand gestures, but in each small, unwavering moment. In how he stepped slowly beside her mother, even when it hurt. In how he brought branches with the softest leaves. In how he touched his mate's forehead every morning, checking for signs of warmth. And in how he held their daughter close each night, shielding her from the winds with the weight of his love. Because staying wasn't weakness. It was the fiercest strength he had ever known. Not the kind that crushed or charged, but the kind that stayed, that softened, that knelt when everything else told it to keep walking. He had been raised to believe that bull elephants did not linger, that presence was a risk, that love was something fleeting and survival came first. But as he watched the calf nudge closer to her mother's chest, tiny trunk curling in confusion, her breath barely lifting the dust, he understood something those before him never had. That survival alone was a shallow kind of living. That this waiting, this watching, this refusal to turn away was the truest kind of courage. He kept the hyenas back that night, not with roars, not with rage, but with stillness, with a towering calm that did not falter. He stood like stone, shadowed in moonlight, his body a wall between them and what mattered most. His ears barely flickered when they circled, when they laughed in the dark. They came close, but not close enough, because something about the way he stood, the way he belonged to that moment, made them pause. And as dawn painted the horizon in shades of silver and sorrow, The mother's eyes finally opened. Just a little, just enough. He didn't move, not even then. He waited. Let her see the calf. Let her see him, the bull who did not leave. The sun rose slower than usual that morning, as if it too were unsure how to begin again. But she rose with it, weak, trembling, but upright. And when she reached out her trunk, brushing it across her mate's chest, something passed between them that had no sound, no shape, but it was real. And their calf watched, still and blinking, as the earth beneath her changed. Because the ground you're born on is not always the ground that holds you. Sometimes it's built in the quiet moments after, when someone chooses you and chooses to stay. They didn't follow the herd that day, not yet. They walked slowly, together. Every step he took beside her rewrote something ancient, something passed down in silence. He had never been taught how to love, but he had learned, and now he was teaching her. And in the echo of their footsteps, the calf began to learn too. Not through words, there were none, but through the rhythm of their presence. She watched the way her father slowed when her mother stumbled, how he waited without frustration, how he turned his body into shade when the sun grew too sharp. She noticed how he didn't lead from the front, but walked beside, always beside. In those early days, every movement mattered. Her mother was healing, bones still weak, muscles still uncertain. And the calf was learning not just how to walk, but how to trust. There was no herd to mirror, no elder females surrounding them with guidance. Just this, a father who stayed and a mother who fought her way back to the world. And somehow, that was enough. They drank from shallow streams where silence replaced fear. They slept under acacia trees that bent toward them, as if they too understood what had been survived. And when the storms came, as they always did, he didn't seek shelter first. He circled them instead, wrapping his massive body around theirs, taking the brunt of the wind, standing still while lightning split the sky. Each time she woke in the night, startled by a strange sound or a shadow in the dark, she would find them, her mother breathing steadily beside her, her father watching, always watching, and slowly the world around them began to shift. Not with grand gestures or loud declarations, but with a quiet that invited safety, with footsteps that didn't rush, with strength that made space instead of demanding it. The calf began to mimic this. She learned when to wait, when to move, when to reach her small trunk toward her mother in support, and when to press her forehead gently into her father's leg, just to remind herself he was real. Because the stories she'd never been told were now being lived in front of her. She didn't need the old ways. She had this. A father who proved that presence could be protection, that love, when chosen again and again, could remake the path itself. They were three hearts bound by a decision no one else had understood, but one that had changed everything. And in their every step, that choice echoed. We stay, we heal, we carry each other forward, not with speed, not with perfection, but with a tenderness that redefined what strength could look like. There were days the mother faltered, her legs unsure, her breath short, but she never fell alone. He was always there, not pushing, not pulling, just being. And somehow that was what gave her the courage to rise again. The calf began to mirror this unspoken language. When her mother paused, she paused too. When her father leaned his great head down to nudge a branch closer to them, she did the same with smaller leaves. The space between them wasn't just filled with movement, it was filled with meaning. Every step was a promise that no one would be left behind. There were no trumpets of celebration, no other herds to bear witness. But in the stillness of that forest, in the hush of dawn where only the birds dared speak, something sacred was happening. The calf began to grow, not just in body but in knowing. She understood that safety wasn't always about being hidden. Sometimes it was about being seen, truly seen, and that to be loved in one's most fragile moments wasn't weakness. It was the foundation of resilience. Some storms live in the moments we feel most alone. But you were never alone. And so, the calf learned not just how to survive, but how to remember. Remember the way his mother breathed slower so he could breathe easier. Remember the way his father stood when the world expected him to walk away. Remember the way love, real love, never asks if it's convenient. He would carry all of it. The quiet strength, the trembling courage, the undeniable truth that you don't need to speak to be understood, and you don't need to fight to be powerful. All you need to do is stay. Stay even when it hurts. Stay even when it's terrifying. Stay because staying changes everything. And that would be his legacy. Not the size of his tusks, not the depth of his footprints, but the gentleness he offered to those walking behind him. Because he had seen what love could survive, and now he knew what it could create. He had seen storms before, winds that bent trees, droughts that cracked the earth. But nothing had shaped him more than the sight of his mate, fragile, trembling, yet unbroken, and their calf nudging against her side as if to say, "We're still here." That was the kind of strength no force of nature could teach. It was born in the quiet moments, in staying, in choosing presence over panic, in lifting each other not with tusks or size, but with the weightless power of being there. That strength passed from him to the calf, not in grand gestures, but in footsteps shared, in the way they walked beside her, forming a silent wall of devotion. The calf watched, learned, imitated the stillness, the listening, the patience, the fierce, gentle resolve. Not because someone told him how, but because he felt it, in the space between them, in the rhythm of their survival, in the legacy of what love chooses to protect. And every day that followed, as the mother grew stronger, they did too. They didn't just recover, they remembered. And from those memories came something deeper than instinct, a trust that didn't need to be spoken, a bond that no danger could sever, because it had been tested and proven. That was the foundation their family would grow from. Not just dirt beneath their feet, but the kind of soil that holds history, that tells new life. This is what we came from. This is what we endured, and this is what we became. A promise whispered in the way they moved as one, in the gentle brush of trunks, in the protective glance that needed no sound. And even when the herd rejoined them, bringing with it the comfort of numbers and the rhythm of migration, they remained something separate, not apart, but elevated, because not all families are built the same. Some are forged in moments most others never see, in choices that break old patterns, in strength that doesn't roar, but remains. It remains in how they walk, slower now, more mindful, as if the ground beneath their feet remembers too. As if every step forward honors the ones that nearly didn't happen. The calf, once unsure and trembling, now moves with the steady rhythm of a family that chose to stay when walking away would have been easier. His small feet echo larger ones, not just in path, but in purpose. Because strength, he's learned, doesn't always look like power. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it's in the way his father paused, lowered his head, and stood beside the one who couldn't rise on her own. And it lives in the silence between them, in the glances exchanged, in the space where fear once lived but was replaced by something softer, something stronger. This family was no longer defined by what they had lost or what they had survived, but by what they had chosen to hold on to. And each day that choice deepened its roots, not just in the soil, but in them. The calf didn't know all the words for what had happened, but he knew what it meant to be carried, to be sheltered, to be loved so fully that even in weakness, he was never alone. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were shaping something new, a rhythm that future calves would be born into, a memory not just of pain, but of rising, not just of danger, but of defiance, not just of breaking, but of rebuilding together. Because when staying becomes a legacy, it doesn't end with the ones who stayed. It becomes a language, a map, a truth passed down without needing to be spoken. And one day when the calf becomes the one who must decide whether to stand still or to stand beside, he won't hesitate. He'll remember. And he'll stay too. Because staying had written itself into his bones, not just as a memory, but as instinct. He wouldn't remember every detail of the day his mother collapsed, or the weight of the storm that nearly tore them apart, but he would remember the feeling, the stillness of his father beside them, the way time didn't rush them, but wrapped around them like protection. He would remember warmth pressed against cold, the shadow of giants standing guard, the rhythm of a heart that said, "I'm here." And that would be enough. Enough to teach him that presence is power. Enough to remind him that strength isn't always loud. It's in the quiet, consistent choice to remain. And when he grew, when his own legs grew long and sure, when his back was strong enough to carry more than just himself, he'd carry that memory too. He'd carry it into places no one had dared to go before. Not because it was easy, but because someone once showed him how. Because someone once said, "You're worth the wait." That kind of message doesn't disappear. It lingers in every decision, every step forward, every act of love that looks like patience, not perfection. He would stay, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. Because he knew what it looked like to be saved by love that didn't leave, and that would make all the difference. Because that's what real legacy looks like. Not a monument or a mark on the ground, but a moment that lives on in choices made long after the story seems over. The calf would grow, and he wouldn't need to remember every crack in the earth or every leaf that trembled in that storm. But he would know what it meant to be protected, to be held when the world felt like it might fall apart. And because of that, he would become a protector too. One day in the hush of another dusk, he would pause. Not because he was uncertain, but because he remembered. Remembered that strength isn't always about pressing forward. Sometimes it's about turning back, waiting, standing still until the one beside you can walk again. He would do that for someone, just as it had been done for him, and the forest would know. The trees, older now, would watch the way he moved, how he didn't rush the small, the scared, the weary, how he stood not in front, but beside. Because the heart that stays learns a rhythm stronger than thunder, a kind of beat passed from parent to child, not through words, but through presence, through every unshaken step, every moment of stillness that said, "I choose you," still. And in that simple truth lay the beginning of everything. Because even when the world felt too vast, too broken, too wild to understand, this choice remained: to stay, to witness, to not look away. The bull elephant didn't just stand guard over his calf and mate during the hardest days. He built a path forward with his presence. And now that quiet devotion echoed in every step the calf took. It was in the way he approached the world, with gentleness that didn't come from weakness, but from being deeply, unshakably loved. One day he would face his own storms, the kind that shake the ground and blur the sky. And in those moments, he wouldn't need to be told what to do. He would simply know, because love like that imprints on the soul. It becomes instinct, deeper than fear, louder than doubt. It turns uncertainty into a promise that says, "I will not abandon, I will not forget, I will not unlove." That is what the bull had passed on, not just survival, but memory, not just strength, but meaning. And the forest would remember him for that, not as the one who led with his size or might, but as the one who stayed, who showed a different kind of power, one rooted in silence, in softness, in presence. And that was the kind of legacy the earth itself could grow from, because some legacies aren't carved into stone or sung by many. They grow quietly, day by day, in the way someone chooses to stay when they could have left. In the way the bull's shadow stretched over the calf, not as dominance, but as shelter. In the way the calf reached his tiny trunk to touch his father's, mimicking a ritual he didn't yet understand, but already believed in. That's how legacy works. It lives in gestures, in echoes, in the spaces between footsteps where protection walks beside possibility. The mother watched it all with tired, grateful eyes, her body still healing, but her heart at peace. She had expected pain. She had expected to bear it alone, as so many before her had. But what she didn't expect was for him to stay, to rearrange everything they were told bulls never do. And with each sunrise, she saw it more clearly. The strength of their calf wasn't just inherited, it was taught through presence. He would grow into a giant, yes, but also into a memory, a continuation, a living reminder that love doesn't vanish in hardship, it anchors deeper. The trees seemed to sway differently when they walked together. The wind quieter, like the forest itself was listening, as if nature was taking notes on how to begin again. Because beginnings like these weren't born in thunder or conquest. They were made in the stillness of commitment, in the quiet decision to remain close, to breathe together, to raise something sacred from the soil of survival. That soil held more than roots. It held memory. It held pain. It held the silent cries of every mother who had once stood alone, and every calf who had wandered without a guide. But now, beneath their feet, it held something else too. A new story. One planted by a father who chose to stand still, who chose to make the ground a place not of departure, but of return. And in that sacred soil, the calf learned not just how to walk, but how to trust, how to pause beneath the sun and know that someone would be beside him when the shadows came. He learned not just to survive, but to belong, because presence, when given without demand, becomes the most fertile gift of all. It becomes the shelter from which everything else can rise. The father never spoke, of course. Elephants don't need words to build legacies, but his every breath beside his mate, every slow step beside his child, carved something deep into the world, into time itself. A softness that didn't shrink from strength, but expanded it. A courage that didn't charge ahead, but knelt low and waited. And through that, the forest changed too. The paths they walked became gentler, the wind quieter. Other herds took notice. And in the calf's eyes, wide, bright, forever searching, was the reflection of two giants who stayed. Not because it was easy, but because love had made it necessary. Because love wasn't just what held them together. It was what shaped the very space between them. It turned silence into safety, distance into devotion, and in the slow, deliberate way the father stood beside them, day after day, rain or heat, hunger or calm. The calf learned what it meant to be held by something invisible, but unshakable. He learned that staying wasn't just about presence, it was about promise. That no matter how far he wandered, or how dark the path ahead might someday become, he had been born into a kind of love that didn't vanish when storms came. A love that endured without needing to be loud. A love that didn't rush because it had nothing to prove. It simply remained. And in the father's quiet strength, the calf found something louder than any trumpet call. A message not shouted but lived. I am here. I am not leaving. Not now. Not ever. It was this rhythm, this dependable, sacred rhythm, that rooted the calf in something deeper than instinct. It rooted him in legacy. Because sometimes the most powerful inheritance isn't land or status or might. It's knowing where you come from and who stayed beside you when it mattered most. And that memory would live in more than just his mind. It would settle into his bones, into the way he stepped through the world. The calf would grow, as all young ones do. He would test the edges of the horizon. He would drift and return, explore and retreat. But no matter how far he roamed, a part of him would always be tethered to that moment, the one where staying redefined what strength could look like. Because what the father had given wasn't just protection, it was identity. It was a sense of being worth the wait, worth the watchful eye, worth standing guard over when the world looked uncertain and the mother lay too still to answer. And that kind of presence, it teaches more than words ever could. It builds a foundation no flood, no drought, no fear could ever wash away. Years would pass, and one day that calf, no longer small, no longer unsteady, would stand beside his own. And without hesitation, he would do the same. He wouldn't run, he wouldn't question, he would stay, because he would remember what was given to him when he couldn't ask for it. And now, with the earth beneath his feet and the breath of generations behind him, he would offer it in return. Not because he was told to, but because he had once been shown how. And that single gesture, so quiet, so instinctual, had rippled into something far greater than either of them could have known. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about inheritance, not of land or strength or stature, but of tenderness, of quiet bravery, of the kind of love that didn't need to be loud to be life-changing. That calf would grow up carrying that lesson like a second heartbeat, invisible but ever present, He would walk into storms with steadier steps, face droughts with steadier breath, and raise his own with the memory of being raised in patience, in devotion, in the steady shadow of a father who didn't walk away when he could have, when the world might have expected him to. And the herd would see it too, in the way he stood when another was afraid, in how he waited when another stumbled, in how he listened, not to reply, but to understand. They would feel something ancient in him, something sacred, not because he was the strongest or the boldest or the first to charge ahead, but because he had once been taught that staying is strength, that softness is not weakness, and that the ones who stay behind are often the ones who carry us forward. And so he stayed, not out of obligation, not out of instinct, but because staying had been made sacred by the one who did it first. Every time the wind shifted, every time the herd grew restless or uncertain, his calm presence anchored them, not with force, but with presence. He became a constant, a quiet center in a world that never stopped changing. And while others looked to the horizon for strength, he looked beside him, to those he carried, to those he guided through memory and tenderness. The calf, now older, no longer needed shelter from storms, but still sought his father's side when the thunder rolled. Not because of fear, but because that space had always been safe, familiar, holy. And with each passing season, the young ones of the herd, those yet untouched by loss, untested by hardship, grew up watching the way he walked with them, not ahead, not behind, but among. That's how legacies grow, not in loud declarations or bold victories, but in footsteps that fall beside yours, in hearts shaped gently by the quiet endurance of love. And when the time came for him to lead, he did so without raising his voice. He didn't need to. The strength was already in the soil he walked on, in the stories passed from eye to eye, from one steady breath to another. Not told, but lived. And because it was lived, it lasted. Through migration and drought, through nights when the stars vanished behind thick clouds, and days when the earth cracked beneath their feet. It lasted in how he slowed his pace so the weakest could keep up, in how he waited, not for the herd but with it, in how he listened when others rushed. These weren't grand gestures. They were choices, repeated, quiet, undeniably strong. And in those choices, something deeper took root, not just in him, but in them. A different kind of strength, one not built on dominance, but devotion, not in leading from the front, but in lifting from the middle. And the calf, now grown and watching from just behind, didn't need to be taught what this meant. He had already learned it. In every moment his father had chosen to stay, in every path his mother had cleared before him. What they built together, father, mother, child, wasn't just a family, it was a promise. That the past wouldn't repeat if love was strong enough to stay present. That staying when you could walk away was the greatest act of courage. That family isn't just who you're born to, but who shows up, again and again, especially when it's hard. And so the calf grew, not just in size, but in understanding. He walked the same trails his father had once carved, beneath the same ancient trees his mother had once leaned against. But the path felt different now. It carried more than footprints. It carried the quiet strength of presence, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be lasting. It carried the story of a family who stayed when leaving would have been easier. Years would pass. Seasons would turn the grass golden, then bare, then green again. But what remained was never the storm, never the silence after, but the love that chose to stay in both. The calf would one day become a father too. And when the rains came, and when the world asked again, "Will you walk away?" He already knew the answer, because someone had once stayed, and that had changed everything. If this story moved you, share it. Let the world remember. Real strength is staying,